I was once asked a question so confidently wrong that I didn't even know how to answer it at first. An American guy heard my accent, smiled, and said, "So, World War II. You guys really struggled until we showed up, huh?" Not mocking. Not arrogant. Just, "Sure." I laughed a little and asked him a simple question. "Which year do you think the war started?" He thought for a second. 1941, he said. I asked, "And what happened before that?" He blinked. Nothing. That pause, that 1 second of silence, told me everything. Because in his version of history, the war doesn't begin until America enters the frame. Everything before that is just background noise. A montage. A blur. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. That's when I realized the problem isn't ignorance. It's editing. But before we dive in, if this kind of quiet, uncomfortable history is your thing, subscribe. Let me show you how the stories we tell ourselves end up shaping the world we actually live in. Wait, so you didn't have tanks? The American asked it, with real concern, like I just confessed Britain fought World War II, using bicycles and blind optimism. I paused. "We invented tanks," I said. He frowned. "Yeah, but not good ones." And that's when it clicked. This wasn't confusion. This was education. I'm British. My grandfather fought in North Africa in 1941, dodging bullets through sandstorms, back when most Americans thought Libya was a brand of coffee. He came home with shrapnel in his leg, and he never once said he did it alone. Because he didn't. He fought beside Australians, Indians, Poles, New Zealanders, men whose names barely survived the footnotes of history. Somewhere between his generation and mine, though, the story mutated. Now I keep meeting Americans who talk about World War II, like it's a Marvel film and they're the lead role. Britain becomes the quirky sidekick. France is the hostage. The Soviets? Deleted scenes. The credits roll. And somehow America invents victory itself. I first noticed this at university. A pub in Manchester, where beer makes history louder. An American exchange student leaned back, totally relaxed, and said, "Yeah, we basically saved Europe." Not joking. Not flexing. Just stating a fact. My French friend Sophie froze mid-sip, went silent. Like her grandfather's resistance stories had just been unplugged. "What about 1939 to 1941? She asked carefully. He smiled. Preparation time. I nearly inhaled my pint. Britain fought alone for a year. The Blitz. Dunkirk. The Battle of Britain. But in his version, Europe was on pause, waiting politely for America to arrive with a soundtrack and better lighting. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't arrogance. It was curriculum. Somewhere in a classroom with fluorescent lights and a Constitution poster, a teacher had said, "America won World War II. Full stop. No footnotes. No allies. No context." And nobody questioned it. Because textbooks don't lie. Here's the pattern I kept noticing. If a story is complex, it gets simplified. If it's shared, it gets owned. And if America shows up late, the timeline quietly rewrites itself. Years become months. Helping turns into saving. Arriving in Act 3 somehow makes you the hero of the whole film. 2 years later, Prague. A hostel near Old Town Square. 20 backpackers from 10 countries arguing about everything at midnight. Someone mentions Auschwitz. The room falls silent. Then Brad leans back. Brad is from Ohio. Brad owns a Captain America backpack. "Yeah," he says, "we basically saved Europe." Again. Marie, a girl from Normandy, slowly puts down her coffee. Her great-grandfather died in the resistance. "What about 1939? She asks. Brad shrugs. Strategic patience. He says it proudly. Like it's doctrine. Marie's accent thickens. "My grandfather was shot while America was being patient." Brad smiles wider. He thinks this is friendly debate. The next night, Brad learns Britain fought alone for a year. You can watch his face collapse in real time. Wait, you didn't have America? Correct. He frowns. But you didn't even have tanks. I breathe in. We invented tanks. Summer 1916. He nods slowly. Yeah, but bad ones. Confidence is amazing when facts are optional. So why didn't Hitler invade? I ask. Operation Sea Lion cancelled in 1940 because the Royal Navy and RAF made it impossible. Brad Googles. His expression changes. They didn't teach us that. Jacob, the German guy, snorts into his beer. Anna from Poland quietly leaves the room. She's heard this too many times. And that's when it hits me. Brad isn't stupid. He's kind. He shares snacks. He asks about our countries. He's just been taught a version where America doesn't join the war, it starts it. Everything before Pearl Harbor is a montage. Everything after is destiny. And destiny doesn't need footnotes. Boston. 2 years later. A museum. Marble floors. Serious lighting. We stop at a massive display. American forces liberated Europe. Not Allied forces. Not combined armies. American forces. My girlfriend notices my face. What? She asks. Who took Berlin? I say. Us? She answers, unsure. The Soviets, I reply. She stops walking. Really? I explain. April 1945. Street fighting. Room by room. 300,000 Soviet dead. She blinks. Why didn't we learn that? Because if textbooks admit who took Berlin, a kid in Ohio might Google who actually broke the Nazis, and the story gets messy fast. This isn't about facts. Facts are easy. This is about narrative. About needing a clean story where good guys arrive, win, and leave. Where 85 million dead becomes a simple arc. America doesn't just teach history. It teaches identity. And identity hates sharing credit. Thanksgiving dinner. I'm the British novelty guest. Uncle Jim is 3 beers deep. If it wasn't for us, you'd all be speaking German, he says, pointing his bottle like a chess move. Britain was never invaded. I reply lightly. Because we saved you, he says, smiling. December 1941 flashes through my mind. I don't say it yet. Lend-Lease, he adds triumphantly, which we paid off until 2006, I reply. Silence drops like a plate. Someone coughs. Someone stares at the ceiling. 61 years of payments, finished while British soldiers were fighting beside Americans in Iraq. History feels different when it suddenly has a price tag. Back in Prague, Brad finds a D-Day documentary. He runs in. Laptop open. American operation, he announces. Thomas, the Polish guy, doesn't look up. 5 beaches, he mutters. 2 American. Brad freezes. He starts Googling. His Captain America backpack now looks less like pride, and more like evidence. A week later, Austin, Texas. A bar that smells like barbecue and confidence. A guy hears my accent and grins. So. World War II, huh? You guys really needed us. Not hostile, friendly. Like gravity in his state. I take a sip. India sent 2.5 million soldiers, I say. Yeah, but the Pacific, he replies instantly. That was our war. I blink. Britain fought in Burma. Malaysia. Singapore. Australians. Indians. New Zealanders. 87,000 Commonwealth soldiers died fighting Japan. He tilts his head. That doesn't really count though, right? I carefully set my beer down. 87,000 people doesn't count. He shifts. I mean, it counts. But like, the real war. That's when I finally understand the real issue. It isn't ignorance. It's editing. Entire fronts vanish because they don't fit the movie. If America isn't placed at the center, the story feels incomplete, like a sentence missing its subject. American history education isn't built around timelines. It's built around narrative arcs. There's a hero, a crisis, A dramatic entrance. Anything that doesn't serve that arc doesn't disappear, it just gets reduced. Shrunk down until it stops being emotionally inconvenient. Complexity is poison to standardized tests. Washington, D.C., 2023. The World War II memorial sits perfectly placed between monuments, framed like the heart of the story, which, to be fair, it is. Just not the whole one. I walk the circle slowly. I read every pillar. 56 of them. States. Territories. Victors. And I notice the absence. A security guard stands near the entrance. Where's the Soviet pillar? I ask. He blinks. This is an American memorial, he says, kindly. Right, I reply. But they were allies. He gestures inward. There's something about them inside. Inside turns out to be a single plaque, smaller than the gift shop sign. One sentence. That's it. One sentence for a country that lost 27 million people. The country that destroyed the bulk of the German army. The country that took Berlin. An old man stands beside me, reading it too. He wears a hat covered in pins and medals. He doesn't look shocked. You know what's strange, he says quietly. I fought alongside the Soviets in April of '45. We met at the Elbe. We hugged. Shared cigarettes. Took photos. He pauses, eyes still on the plaque. Those men had been fighting non-stop for 4 years. Most people walking through here don't even know they were on our side. He taps his cane once and walks away. I start doing the math. America lost roughly 400,000 soldiers during the entire war. The Soviets lost that many in single battles. Stalingrad alone killed more people than all American and British losses combined. Numbers like that don't sit neatly on plaques. A few months later, I'm back in Europe. Berlin, a cafe near the Brandenburg Gate. Someone taps my shoulder. It's Brad. Same Captain America backpack, slightly faded now. Different face. Man, he says, sitting down. I was wrong. Like, painfully wrong. He's been traveling. Normandy. Warsaw. Auschwitz. Stalingrad memorials. Standing there changes something, he says quietly. It stops being a story. It becomes, wait. I nod. What now? I ask. He smiles. I'm going to teach history. High school. Ohio. I raise an eyebrow. You're going to cause trouble. He grins. Good. The textbooks haven't changed, I warn. You'll be fighting the same battle I've been fighting. He stirs his coffee, pauses, then looks up. Perfect timing. Strategic patience. I almost choke laughing. That's how. I know he actually learned something. You only joke about myths after they break. And that's the real problem. Myths aren't evil. They're comforting. They turn chaos into order. They make death feel meaningful. But when myths harden into identity, they stop being stories. They become weapons. And questioning them feels like an attack, even when it's just context. Back in London, I open my grandfather's old photo box. Black and white faces. Men from countries that no longer exist, smiling in uniforms they never chose. None of them thought they were heroes. They thought they were surviving. They never argued over credit. They were just relieved it ended. That's what's missing from the American version. Relief, the sense that victory was shared, messy, terrifying, and fragile. Instead, it's clean, triumphant, exportable. Something you can turn into films, slogans, and museum plaques. We saved the world fits better on a t-shirt than we barely survived together. I don't hate Americans for believing this story. Sometimes, I envy it. It must be comforting to grow up inside a narrative where you're always the rescuer, never the desperate one. Where the war begins when you arrive and ends when you leave. It's reassuring. It's also wrong. What surprises me most is how easily the story fractures. One conversation. One museum visit. One uncomfortable Google search. Brad didn't change, because, I argued, he changed because reality brushed against the myth. That's all it takes. Not shouting. Just friction. That's why I keep having these conversations. In pubs. In hostels. At dinner tables. In museums. Not to win debates, but to put weight back into the story. Because history without weight becomes entertainment. And entertainment always demands a main character. Even when the truth never had one. A year after Berlin, I'm in Chicago. A house party full of strangers. Someone hears my accent, smiles and says, "So you're from the country we saved?" Automatic. Muscle memory. I smile back. "Which time?" I ask. He laughs, then realizes I'm serious. We end up in the kitchen, leaning against the counter like it's confession hour. He tells me his grandfather landed in Normandy. I tell him mine fought in the desert. We both go quiet. For a moment, the war isn't a story. It's two old men who never met, connected by fear and dirt. "That's wild," he says finally. "They never taught us any of that." I nod. "They taught you the part where you arrive." He looks uncomfortable. Like I rearranged furniture in his head without asking. "So, we didn't save Europe?" He asks carefully. "You helped save it," I say. That's the better version. This is where the tension always lives. Helping sounds smaller than saving, even when it's more honest. Shared victories don't create clean heroes. They create responsibility. If everyone helped, nobody owns it, and ownership is the currency of national pride. The problem with the American version of the war isn't that it's false. It's that it's incomplete. Like a map missing entire countries because they didn't fit the page. Britain. The Commonwealth. Resistance movements. The Soviets. The Poles. The Canadians. All pushed into the margins of someone else's triumph. Every time I mention Britain was still paying war loans in 2006, Americans stare like I've told them the moon is rented. 61 years of payments. Longer than most marriages. Longer than most memories. It doesn't fit a story where victory is instant and free. What's ironic is that American sacrifice doesn't need exaggeration. 400,000 dead is already unimaginable. The factories, the logistics, the scale, all real, all extraordinary. But instead of adding those truths, the myth consumes everyone else's sacrifices to make room. That's how myths grow. Not by adding truth, but by subtracting context. First, allies blur. Then they shrink. Then they disappear. Eventually, you're left with one hero, standing alone on a battlefield that was once crowded. I think about that old veteran in Washington, staring at the tiny Soviet plaque. He didn't sound angry. Just tired. Like someone watching a photograph get cropped smaller every year. First his friends vanish. Then his enemies. Then the war itself turns into a slogan you can print on a mug. And still, I keep talking. Because the conversations matter. Brad matters. Uncle Jim matters. The guy in Austin matters. Not because they're wrong, but because they're teachable. They're proof the myth survives mostly because no one pushes back gently enough to crack it. Brad texts me sometimes now. Photos of his classroom. Maps on the walls. Old black and white faces on slides. Blew some minds today, he writes. Kids didn't know about the Eastern Front. I smile every time. That's how stories change. One confused student at a time. History doesn't need better heroes. It needs balance. The war wasn't a movie. It was collapse. Shared panic. A global nightmare that required everyone to bleed and keep going when hope disappeared. No single country carried that alone. Not even close. So when an American tells me they saved Europe, I don't argue anymore. I ask questions. Saved it from what? With who? For how long? And if you wait long enough, silence does the rest. Silence is where myths start to sweat. The truth is harder to memorize, but easier to respect. It's a story where nobody wins alone. Nobody arrives on time. Everyone pays more than expected. It's not cinematic. It won't fit on a t-shirt. But it's real. And real stories last longer than slogans. My grandfather never spoke about glory. He talked about sand in his boots. The sound of planes. The relief of waking up alive. That's the version I trust. The one without a main character. The one where survival itself was the victory. Americans didn't invent winning wars. They joined one, and helped finish it. That's enough. It's always been enough. The rest is marketing, repetition, and a curriculum that mistakes simplicity for truth. If you've ever argued about history and felt like you were speaking different languages, you probably were. One of you learned facts. The other learned a story. And stories fight back when you try to edit them. If you enjoyed watching me politely dismantle American myths for 15 minutes, hit subscribe. I've got stories about the Revolutionary War, and trust me, the French are still furious. Drop a comment. What's the biggest historical myth you were taught? Let's compare notes. Gently. Somewhere out there, Brad is teaching a class, wearing that ridiculous backpack, explaining that Britain had tanks, the Soviets took Berlin, and nobody saved anyone alone. For the first time, the story is heavier, messier, and finally honest. Cheers. History didn't have a main character. We added one later. If that sentence made you uncomfortable, you're probably in the right place. Subscribe. This channel exists for people who don't mind sitting with discomfort.